In August 1914, at the outbreak of the Great War in Europe, aircraft did not enter into the plans of the belligerents.
They didn't understand what it could be used for, or at least that's what those who were more enthusiastic about it argued. Those who were pushing for the use of aircraft, the very early airmen, as it were, they saw tremendous potential for the aircraft as not just an observation, artillery spotting kind of task, which is what most of the generals saw it as. This was the ultimate high ground, you know, not using balloons or dirigibles here, but you could use this mobile aircraft to spot the enemy, so you could range your artillery and so on. But they saw it as having other functions in battle. And as the war went on, they came up with more and more as they experimented with how to use this. And they complained over and over again that the ground generals simply didn't understand what this machine could do for them. And were wasting it, using it simply for observation or for reconnaissance or for photographing or whatever they were using it for, and that it could be an offensive weapon. And they begin to talk about fighters and bombers. Bombing became the big thing.
The frontline troops of all the nations, slaughtering each other on the far-flung battlefields, counted in the millions. The number of total aircraft deployed by the combatants amounted to a little over 500, fragile, unarmed monoplanes and biplanes.
Remember, World War I, it had stalemated in that trench warfare in France. And most of the war was fought just in inches, really. You come over the top and maybe move the line a little bit, and then the other side would come over the top and maybe move it a little bit the other way, and it was just mass slaughter. And the airmen began to argue that airplanes were free of this. They were above the ground. They could fly anywhere and could strike anything. And so they really began to tout the aircraft as a strategic bomber, where you could use it to go back and fly against supply lines and factories and hit public morale and end this horrible, horrible war and end it much more quickly.
Those early military pilots who were flying over the trenches of the Western Front were essentially aerial chauffeurs. Their job was to ferry an observer over the countryside to report on troop movements. In the first months of the war, there was plenty to observe, with the Germans overrunning Belgium and advancing on Paris.
A circular came round all cavalry divisions asking for specified lightweight officers to volunteer to become observers.
In the east, German aviators located the advancing Russian army, allowing field commanders to move troops to where they were needed most, and giving the outnumbered Germans an epic victory at Tannenberg. In the west, French aircraft returned to their base to report that the enemy's armies had made a fatal mistake and exposed their flank. This bit of intelligence allowed the French to turn the tide and doom Europe to 4 long years of trench warfare. In 1915, photography replaced sketches and handwritten notes as a technique for aerial reconnaissance.
Reconnaissance was very important, and again, there were instances during World War I where aircraft were able to spot troop movements or where troops had been deployed that then sent useful intelligence back to the generals and knowing where to attack. They developed very accurate, for the day, aerial photography. Sherman Fairchild, in particular in the United States, comes up with cameras that they were able to make very detailed photographs of battlefields, which gave important information to them. Specific battles and exact details I can't give you off the top of my head. But the reconnaissance use of aircraft was very valuable. And that's really what the generals saw as its chief value: intelligence gathering, being able to know what was happening. They saw it as an auxiliary to their grand plans for their armies, rather than as an independent branch of the military.
Aircraft with pilot observers equipped with unwieldy box cameras were sent out day after day over the front to take photographs of the endless trenches and gun emplacements. With freezing fingers, observers hung over the sides of their ships in gale-like slipstreams to get a shot at the enemy below. The job was unglamorous and dangerous. The aircraft had to fly straight and steady, making it an inviting target from ground fire and eventually armed aircraft.
I wonder how long my nerves will stand this daily ground fire. I would not mind it so much if I were in a machine that was fast and that would climb a little more willingly. Well, I suppose the end will be pretty sharp and quick. Lieutenant William Reed, Royal Flying Corps.
In addition to observation, early warbirds began to drop bombs on the enemy. At first, the bombs were nothing more than hand grenades and converted artillery shells. But soon this was refined to projectiles capable of destroying factories and railroads. By 1917, sturdier, specialized bombers began to appear with bomb racks and bomb sights. Raids were carried out in daylight when air superiority allowed it, and at night when it did not. By the end of the war, aircraft roamed the front, bombing bridges and airfields and strafing troops, proving that the airplane had made the battlefield three-dimensional. The third use of the airplane in war was as an attack aircraft. For the generals, the only reason to place guns on an airplane was to protect the reconnaissance aircraft. But for the pilots and observers, it was a means to have a go at the other fellow. The first recorded aerial victory occurred on October 5, 1914, when a French pusher aircraft downed a German aviatique.
Again, when the aircraft was first being used, the idea was reconnaissance, artillery spotting, that kind of thing, and you would literally have the opposing fighters or flyers crossing each other in the air, because each one wanted to spy on the other one, and there wasn't much they could do about that. But some of these enterprising pilots then decided to take up small arms with them. And so they would literally be shooting out of their cockpit at their opponents, trying to fire at them. That's not a very efficient way to fire out of an airplane. And so they began to try and think, well, how can we then point our aircraft at somebody and fire at them? The problem is you have this gigantic propeller out in front of you. But they try, because the propeller, there are voids as it spins. They try mounting the machine gun very high. They try all kinds of things, but generally speaking, either the recoil from the gun or bullets hitting the propeller were bad outcomes for a lot of them who initially started to try and do that, until, of course, Anthony Fokker comes up with the synchronization, so that you could fire a machine gun out and it would literally go through the voids in the propeller arc. And it wouldn't fire when a propeller blade would be right in front of your line of fire, but would once the propeller blade moved out of the way. And with the RPMs of the propellers at that time, it was a very doable thing.
For the most part, firing pistols and flares had limited effect on a foe traveling at 90 miles an hour. Mounting machine guns on their aircraft would change all that. Dutch designer Anthony Fokker made aerial combat possible when he created a propeller interrupter that allowed a forward-mounted machine gun to be placed on a German Eindecker monoplane, thus creating the first true fighter plane. It was so effective and took such a horrific toll on Allied aircraft that the British called it the Fokker Scourge.
I do know that that synchronization device changed the equation, because now German aircraft could strafe. They could fire at other aircraft, and so then there was a scramble on the other side to develop our own synchronization mechanism. And as much as there were tides in the air war, the Fokker Scourge really was a turning of the tide, and then forced the other side to come up with an answer to it.
The Fokker Scourge came from the Fokker Eindecker, which was almost a shoulder wing airplane, and it was the first aircraft manufactured with a machine gun on it. The first airplane that had a machine gun on it was a Marine Saunier that was flown by a fellow by the name of Roland Garros. He put the gun on the airplane and just shot through the propeller, and of course occasionally the bullet struck the propeller. So he had steel plates bolted to the propeller as bullet deflectors. And when he introduced it to the French government, they shot 100 rounds to it, and the ricocheting bullets off of the plates on the propellers killed 2 bystanders. And the government said, "This is fine, this will work, we'll use it." Well, the German Eindecker had a front-mounting machine gun that fired through the propellers, and it was a result of Roland Garros getting shot down, and they found out what he was doing. So all of the Eindeckers were equipped with forward-firing machine guns through the propellers. None of the British and French airplanes had that capability, and the German Eindecker could absolutely just shoot them down at will, because the airplanes were more accurate. They were like shooting a rifle. And that's where the Fokker Scourge came from, because they just lost so many airplanes to the Fokker.
By 1916, fighter planes were being grouped in squadrons as tactics were developed for fighting formations, and a new breed of warrior was born, the fighter pilot. When Germany developed its first true fighter plane, it was logical that they would put the controls in the hands of the fatherland's best pilots. Max Immelmann and Oswald Boelke, as members of Flight Section 62, were among the first pilots to receive the Fokker Eindecker, and they used it to deadly effect. The great Max Immelmann's legend was confused and contradictory even during the war. A fierce fighter pilot dubbed the Eagle of Lily by his opponents, he was a mama's boy whose mother regularly sent him chocolates. Even his death remains clouded in conflicting and self-serving claims. When the war broke out in 1914, 24-year-old Max requested the aviation service. His record as a pilot trainee is unclear. Some sources say he was a poor student, but others describe him as a natural. Initially, he flew the mail and supplies to the German airdromes, but was soon assigned to piloting photo reconnaissance aircraft. When the Eindecker reached the front, Immelmann and fellow pilot Oswald Boelke were given a chance with the revolutionary new weapons. On August 1st, 10 British BE-2Cs bombed the Douai aerodrome. Boelke and Immelmann went after the departing Englishman, but Boelke's gun jammed after he had fired a few rounds. He landed to fix it and saw Immelmann attack the BE-2s. Immelmann put his fragile fighter into a dive and fired, first at one plane and then another. One started into a steep glide, and Immelmann tailed it all the way to the ground. His gunfire had broken the pilot's elbow and forced him to land. On the ground, Immelmann approached the British pilot. They shook hands, and Immelmann informed the Englishman that he was a prisoner. For this exploit, Max received the Iron Cross, First Class. In the fall of 1915, Immelman and Boelke continued to carry on a friendly rivalry, matching each other victory for victory. Neither was a fancy flyer. Immelman wrote, "I do not employ tricks when I attack." On January 12, 1916, Immelman and Boelke both scored their 8th victories, prompting their decoration with the Blue Max. On June 18th, Immelman engaged the FE-2Bs of RFC Squadron 25. According to British accounts, gunfire from an FE-2, piloted by Lieutenant G.R. McCudden and gunned by Corporal J.H. Waller, hit Immelman's Fokker and it spiraled into the ground. Refuting the notion that a lowly two-seater FE-2 had brought down their leading ace, the Germans announced that he had been downed by anti-aircraft fire. This explanation also suited Tony Fokker, who filed a report noting that the fuselage had been shot in two by shrapnel fire. Other sources, including Max's brother Franz, blamed the interrupter gear and claimed that amongst the wreckage, his propeller had been found, shot away right in line with his own guns. Most authorities concur with this explanation, but like so many events of World War I's aerial combat, the death of Max Immelman remains obscured by conflicting reports and uncertainty. Immelman's squadron mate, Oswald Boelke, is considered to be the father of the dogfight. Boelke envisioned the grouping of hand-picked pilots in fighter squadrons, or Jagdstaffeln. Boelke was born in 1891, the son of a schoolteacher in Halle, Germany. Both studious and athletic as a youth, Oswald excelled at mathematics and physics, and also took up swimming, tennis, rowing, and gymnastics. Imbued with German nationalism and militarism from his father, at the age of 13, young Oswald took the outrageous step of writing Kaiser Wilhelm directly for an appointment to military school. He joined the military and at Darmstadt first encountered the aviation branch, which he joined as an NCO pilot. His older brother Wilhelm also joined the aviation service as an NCO observer. In those early days, observers had more status than pilots, who were likened to mere chauffeurs. Both were decorated in the first year of the war. In early 1915, Oswald Boelke was assigned to the newly formed Aviation Section 62 at Doberitz. It was here that Tony Fokker first demonstrated his first E-1 monoplane, Eindecker, equipped with a fixed Spandau machine gun. While flying the Fokker monoplane, Boelke downed 5 enemy aircraft by the end of 1915. By August of 1916, the good times were over for the German pilots. The Fokker Scourge no longer dominated the skies over the Western Front. The French streamlined Nieuport 11 and the British Pusher biplanes were giving the Germans trouble, and Boelke began to focus on tactics to counter them, accurate gunnery, tight formations, and staying within the German lines. In September 1916, Boelke's dream of a superstar squadron was granted. He was given command of a new fighter squadron, Jasta II. Even while assuming new administrative duties, Boelke shot down 11 British planes in September. As the leader of Jasta II, he passed his knowledge on to many of Germany's greatest flyers, including Manfred von Richthofen. Boelke and his pilots used numbers and tactics rather than individual skill to overwhelm their foes. Jasta II only flew in large, well-organized formations, dubbed circuses. Any Allied plane that came within their section of the sky was doomed. Boelke cared little for his personal record. What he cared about was making sure his young pilots got the enemy in their gun sights and came home alive. Boelke set down his principles for combat, known as Boelke's Dicta. He taught that pilots should attack from behind and out of the sun, fire only at close range, and when attacked from above, turn and face the enemy.
Everything. The high altitude bombing, formation flying, the types of attacks they did. In World War I, just about every tactic you could think of was created at one form or the other that is used now, other than the high-tech electronics and radar and things like that. But as far as formation flying, high altitude bombing, all that came from World War I.
In the fall of 1916, he shot down 21 Allied aircraft in 2 months, increasing his total to 40. But like Immelman before him, his luck ran out on October 28, 1916. During a fierce dogfight, he collided with another German aircraft and spiraled to Earth and his death. In a gesture from another era, British flyers honored their downed enemy by dropping a wreath at his burial site, inscribed, "To the memory of Captain Bolke, our brave and chivalrous foe." These young men were part of a rare breed, soldiers in history's bloodiest war who fought one-on-one, far above the stench and carnage in the trenches below. Britain's Prime Minister David Lloyd George told a wartime audience that airmen were the knighthood of the war, without fear and without reproach. That sense of chivalry was summed up by one British flyer in a letter home.
I hate to shoot a Hun down without him seeing me. Although this method is in accordance with my doctrine, it is against what little sporting instincts I have left. James McCudden, Royal Flying Corps.
But not all aces spent time looking for skilled opponents. Edward Manock once chanced upon 6 German aircraft on a training flight. He shot down the instructor and then picked off the 5 defenseless students one by one. There were many brave aces on both sides during the Great War, but the greatest hunter of the skies was a charming and humorous Prussian known by his admiring foes simply as the Red Baron.
Fight on and fly on to the last drop of blood and the last drop of fuel, to the last beat of the heart. Manfred von Richthofen.
Baron Manfred von Richthofen transferred from the Prussian cavalry to the air service in 1915. Having flown as an observer and a bomber pilot in the East, he was chosen by Bolke to join his Jasta in France. Eventually, he was given command of Jasta 11. Because of its garishly colored machines, the British soon christened the unit Richthofen's Flying Circus. Having survived a head wound during a dogfight in July 1917, Richthofen was pressured by his superiors to withdraw from combat. The High Command had reason to be concerned about their heroic ace. The young Baron was so beloved by the German people that it was felt by the Kaiser that his death would be a crushing blow to German morale. In spite of this concern, during the 1918 spring offensive, he climbed back into the cockpit to lead his men into battle. On April 21st, the Red Baron's luck ran out when he was shot through the heart while pursuing a British SOP flying low behind Allied lines. Whether he was shot by an Australian machine gun or Canadian Roy Brown is still debated. His bright red triplane came down behind British lines. Richthofen's body was removed from the cockpit and buried with full military honors by the enemy he terrorized. His final victory total was 80 Allied aircraft destroyed. No other pilot would reach that total until World War II. No non-German has come close to that total even today. The best fighter pilots on both sides were far from immune from the pressure of the war. Before they died, and most of them did die, many were harrowed men from too many hours in the air. Some drove themselves beyond human limits. The great French ace Guynemer feared that if he withdrew from combat, people would say it was because he had won all the awards. He was unfit, physically ill, racked by paranoia and insomnia, yet he died while flying. Like a fabled warrior legend, Guynemer would vanish on a mission. Not a trace of him or the aircraft was ever found. A few aces died a hero's death. One was German ace Werner Voss. On September 23, 1917, Voss, flying alone in his pale blue Fokker, was attacked by an entire flight of SE-5s, led by British ace James McCudden. As the SE-5s dived, he spun on his tail to face them.
By now, the German triplane was in the middle of our formation, and its handling was wonderful to behold. The pilot seemed to be firing at all of us simultaneously, and although I got behind him a second time, I could hardly hold him in my sights. James McCudden, British Royal Flying Corps.
2 British machines went down in the fight, but then the Germans' luck ran out. Arthur David latched onto his tail and raked the triplane with repeated bursts of fire. The aircraft hit the ground and disappeared into 1,000 pieces. No matter how they died, to that generation they were the equivalent of the Knights of the Round Table. In 1917, as America prepared to enter the Great War, U.S. air power ranked just 14th in the world. America's only trained combat aviators were those flying in France with the famous Lafayette Escadrille. The Lafayette Squadron was formed in April 1916, when American Norman Prince and a group of 7 others were allowed to form a squadron in the hope that it would encourage the United States to enter the war. The American Volunteers were a devil-may-care group that included Ivy League football players, Southwestern cowboys, and even the son of a former president of the United States. Though they fought bravely, they could not compete with Germany, whose air force dominated the skies over Europe's battlefields. By June, they were thrown into the fighting over the battlefield at Verdun. Flying 5 patrols a day, all 7 of the original pilots were either killed or wounded by the end of the month. Almost a year after the United States entered the war, the Lafayette Squadron was integrated into the U.S. Army Air Service. Other American pilots serving with the French were also invited to transfer to American units, with the exception of Eugene Jacques Bullard, who was passed over because he was black. In the air, as on the ground, the U.S. was hardly ready to fight a world war.
Believe me, we were far from ready. I was a rookie cadet, I ought to know. They gave us wooden guns and told us we were going to turn the tide. For training equipment, we molded our own bombs out of plaster. Pretty soon we trained with the real things, and having met the ground training requirements, we were issued leather flying togs and helmets. It was a proud day. First, we made a pre-flight check of our bailing wire planes. Then we tried out our wings. 50 hours in the air, a few bombs, and we were ready for advanced training overseas.
America was producing airmen, but it still didn't have a single fighting airplane. Soon voices began to be raised in Washington, advocating the development of U.S. Army air power. Newton Backer, Secretary of War, insisted supremacy of the air in modern warfare is essential. President Woodrow Wilson proposed $600 million to meet the needs of military aviation, and while Congress debated his request, the newly minted pilots were dispatched over there. Though they went without airplanes, they did go in style. Camouflaged luxury liners like the Leviathan were used as troop ships.
Most of us, half-trained but eager to fight, went to France. There we found cities of wooden barracks and muddy streets. In outdoor classes, we practiced gunnery. Wooden models taught us how to lead an airplane with our fire. Battle-tested aviators took time out from the war to show us how to handle a stick. It was much easier to talk about turning the tide than to produce fighting aces overnight.
Late in 1917, the 1st Aero Squadron was formed under the command of Major Ralph Royce. Royce's men were the first all-American aviation unit to see combat action. They were young and untested, but they did not lack for daring. They proudly pasted paper iron crosses over enemy bullet holes in their aircraft and showed their American pride with their Uncle Sam hat-in-the-ring fuselage artwork. When Major William Thor and the Lafayette Escadrille became the 103rd Aero Squadron, they brought a record of triumphs and much-needed experience to the American Air Service. Along with him came Captain Field Kindley, who shot down 12 enemy planes, as did Captain Elliott Springs with 9 kills. One of the old hands in the young American service was Major Raoul Lufberry, who had 17 enemy kills. Lufberry was born in France, but moved to the U.S. at age 19. When war broke out, he enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. In May 1916, however, he joined the Lafayette Escadrille. He soon became its leading ace. In 1918, he joined the U.S. Army Air Services as a combat instructor. He was killed in May 1918 after rushing to the aid of an inexperienced pilot. Racked by machine gun fire, Lufberry's Newport caught on fire in the sight of his airfield, and with the rest of the squadron watching, he jumped to his death rather than burn alive. The ace of American aces was former race car driver Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who ran up an amazing 26 kills in air combat. The rough-talking Captain Eddie had an all-business approach to aerial combat.
Fighting in the air is not sport. It's scientific murder. Captain Edward Rickenbacker, U.S. Army Air Service.
As the young Yanks took to the sky in borrowed French Newports, and if they were lucky, a few worn-out Spad 13s, the country that first took to the skies struggled to catch up with an American warbird of its own.
America's airplane factories and us war workers didn't get started until late. To make airplane wings, they took house carpenters, furniture upholsterers, even seamstresses. Painters used varnish that smelled like bananas. After each plane was test flown, we tore it down for packing, under guard. Then, crated and addressed, it was sent off to the front.
In May 1918, the first American DH-4s were shipped in pieces from American factories to France, where parts were reassembled into the fighting craft, which helped sweep the enemy out of the sky. Only 8 months after they were ordered into production, they joined American aviators ready for the big push. Even before the Great War, the airship was fixed in the minds of the public as a symbol of terror. As early as 1908, H.G. Wells had described an airship raid on New York that left the city in ruins and blazing conflagrations and heaped and scattered dead. However, at this stage of the war, no nation's air service was capable of fulfilling Wells' vision of aerial destruction. Metal-framed Zeppelins and plywood-framed Chuta-Lanzas revealed serious drawbacks in combat. They could not survive over the battlefield. Traveling at under 50 miles an hour, they presented large, tempting targets for gunners on the ground and nimble fighters in the air. 4 huge airships were shot down in the first month of the war. The one weapon the airship had in its favor was stealth. On a moonless night, despite the bulk, Zeppelins could evade detection and pursuit. the great airships became night raiders. The Imperial German Army and Navy used airships to bomb a variety of strategic targets under the cover of darkness, including Paris. But the most prized target was London. German school children learned to sing, "Zeppelin fly, fly to England, England will burn in fire." The arrival of airships over Britain in 1915 made a deep impression on the helpless civilian population. None who heard the thumping of the Maybach engines or witnessed the dark silhouette passing overhead in the night ever forgot the experience. Yet, airship commanders found mounting a sustained campaign risky. Flying from bases in the north of Germany or occupied Belgium to Britain and back in pitch darkness was a dangerous task. Once Britain deployed night fighters and ground batteries armed with incendiary ammunition, travel to London under the vast gas bag seemed like a very bad idea. The first airship raids over Britain began in January 1915, and the first raid on London the following May. Although sporadic, the raids were successful. Not only did the raids destroy a fair number of war supplies and cost many lives, they also forced the British to divert valuable resources of aircraft and men from the Western Front. In late 1916, the Germans launched the most ambitious airship bombing offensive of the war. It was a disaster. Waiting for the German airships was the Home Defense Wing, flying BE-2C biplanes. When an airship raid was detected, they took off from airstrips lit by flares. Once in the air, they relied on the faintly visible line of the horizon to keep their sense of balance and hold the aircraft on a true heading. On patrol for 3 hours, the wing was about to give up when suddenly the SL-11 was bathed in the light of a dozen searchlights on the ground. Armed with explosive and incendiary ammunition, the Brits drove toward the airship and came up under its nose, raking it with fire from bow to stern. Lieutenant William Leaf Robinson was on his third pass when he noticed the airship began to glow. The event was visible for miles. Londoners who had been the dying ship's target began to cheer. The blaze was also witnessed, but with a very different sentiment, by Captain Ernst Lehmann, commander of the SL-11's sister ship, now heading for home.
I saw far behind us a bright ball of fire. Poor fellows, they were lost the moment the ship took fire. Zeppelin Captain Ernst Lehmann.
The Germans lost 4 ships and crews, including their best pilot, Captain Heinrich Matthey, who leaped to his death from his burning Zeppelin rather than being roasted alive. Leif Robinson was awarded the Victoria Cross for his victory, only to be killed the following year on the Western Front. The German High Command responded to this aerial setback with a new type of airship that was bigger but lighter than the previous ones. These high climbers flew at over 16,000 feet, out of the reach of ground fire and most aircraft. But if the crews could safely climb out of reach of the enemy, they could not escape the deadly grip of Mother Nature. For hours on end, they endured freezing cold. The thin air made them nauseated, and the rapid change of pressure gave them the bends. For all their suffering, they inflicted minor damage on the British homeland. From the start of the war, the Germans had wanted to use heavier-than-air aircraft for strategic bombing, but lacked a suitable machine until the advent of the Gotha 2-engine bomber. The Gothas began raids on Britain in the summer of 1917 with impressive effect. Both the air defenses and the civilian population were unprepared for formations of bombers attacking in broad daylight. When 14 Gothas appeared over London for the first time on June 13th, crowds of people ran into the streets to watch them. The falling bombs killed 162 people. The Gothas flew faster than the Zeppelins and were far harder to shoot down. When flying in formation, they could dish out heavy punishment to pursuing aircraft from their combined firepower. Because they could be produced much more quickly and cheaply than airships, they could be deployed in far greater numbers. The largest airplanes to fly in the Great War were the heavy bombers. The most famous of these R-planes was the Zeppelin Staaken RV-1, introduced in 1917. These huge machines had two pilots sitting side by side. They also carried mechanics that tended the engines in flight. It took 40 men to prepare the giant for its mission, loading bombs, filling the fuel tanks, and tuning the four 250-horsepower engines. After a light supper, the 8-man crew would board the aircraft that was waiting for them with engines idling. With only calculations of time, speed, and direction to tell them where they were, the bomber wing would lumber toward its British target.
Inside the fuselage, the pale glow of dimmed lights outlined the chart table, the wireless equipment, and the instrument panel. Under us, a black abyss. Hauptmann Arthur Schuler.
Suddenly, in the night sky, they would see searchlights probing the sky, telling them that they were at last over England. The bombers would fly straight ahead as their machine gunners tried to hit the lights below. If they were lucky, there would be a break in the clouds, through which the pilot and observer could see the Thames River and the docks covered with the tools of war. The observer would move forward to the open post in the nose, from which he would release the bombs. With the release of the last bomb, they would turn for home. In the summer and fall of 1918, formations of Allied bombers began to fly raids deep into Germany as well. Predictably, bad weather and unreliable aircraft limited the effectiveness of the bomber offensive. But civilians in cities such as Frankfurt and Mannheim were taught the terror of air raids that had been experienced by inhabitants of Paris and London. The final assessment of World War I strategic bombing was not encouraging. At that stage of development, air power could not disrupt production nor weaken the population's will to fight. Bombing was costly and inaccurate. The building of large bombers was nonetheless an important step in the progress of aviation. Bomber crews had accumulated extensive experience in long-distance flight and night flying, and the large aircraft would be modified to carry passengers and freight. The strategic bombers of World War I paved the way for those which would follow. Germany launched its final offensive of the war on March 21, 1918. Using ground attack aircraft in support of the shock troops, the Germans were able to penetrate the Allied line in several places. Once again, the Kaiser's armies were driving on Paris. The air battles grew in fury to match the carnage on the ground. The Germans even sent their heavy Gotha bombers into the fight to attack key positions and supply dumps. With victory in sight, the German offensive ran out of gas, literally. By June, flying missions were cut back due to the lack of fuel. While the Allies were able to replace lost aircraft and men, the Imperial German Air Service was not. American flyers were now arriving in the thousands. In July, the Allies went on the offensive. The Germans were swamped in the air by this influx of manpower and industrial might. By the time of the Saint-Michel offensive in September, the Allies had complete control of the sky.
When the order came to prepare for battle, truckloads of aerial bombs were delivered to the planes. There, armorers fused the bombs and loaded the rigs. Then the boys who had to take them up made sure the job was done right.
From only 500 aircraft on all fronts in 1914, air power had grown to the point where U.S. General Billy Mitchell commanded a force of 1,500 British, French, and American aircraft over a small sector of the Western Front.
It was the big push. When we lifted the flaps that September morning in 1918, everything was ready. Billy Mitchell had asked for every airplane that could fight, and we brought him out. All the Allied force on the continent gave its planes. General Mitchell called for 1,500, and we actually got 1,481 off the ground. Wooden props bit into the air, and the engines roared as we began to rev up. Our mission was to control the skies above the San Miguel sector. This was the First Army's field of battle. Some had orders to bomb and strafe enemy installations. Others to engage the Germans in the air. This was it.
Each pilot had been carefully briefed for his part in the mission. U.S. aviators in 609 American planes, now a solid part of Allied air power, rose to the attack. They supported troops on the ground, struck airfields, and shot up observation balloons, burning them out of the sky. The German airmen, short of supplies and exhausted from too many missions, never gave up. In fact, they inflicted heavier losses than they suffered. But in the end, valor was not enough. On November 11th, 1918, the Great War ended. The war cost an estimated 9 million lives. Of those, some 15,000 were airmen. Flight had lost its innocence.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. To be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Oh, balls right, son, how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. What? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? For us, retard, when we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Come to the cookhouse door, boys, sniff at the lovely stew. Oh, as it says the colonel gets better grub than you. Any complaints this morning? Do we complain? Not we. What's the matter with lumps of onion floating around your tea? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley has gone.